Hi there. Here's part three, and I told you last time, so we're in Daniel 5, and I told you last time I would tell you when we discovered, we've known about Nabonidus for a long time, the son of the one of the kings that came after Nebuchadnezzar. And it wasn't this Belshazzar that just the Bible just skips from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar, and from the last verse in chapter 4 to chapter 5 verse 1, and all of a sudden Belshazzar is king. And people have looked at the record, through the ages for years, the extra biblical record, the historical records, and it says, well, there's three kings right after Nebuchadnezzar and none of them are named Belshazzar. The Bible must be off its rocker. It's not right. Well, 1854, that's fairly recent. 1854, I mean, just before the American Civil War, the British consul J.G. Taylor was exploring some ruins in southern Iraq for the British Museum and came across several small cylinders, which were common back then, inscribed with 60 or so lines of cuneiform, which is the type of writing that was there. And it turned out that the inscriptions had been written at the command of Nabonidus, who ruled in Babylon from 555 to 539, BC, and we know that. And it says it commemorated the repair of a temple tower at Ur, and they contained a prayer for long life and good health of Nabonidus and his eldest son Belshazzar. And for the first time, somebody realizes, oh, wait, Belshazzar, that's in the Bible. After Nebuchadnezzar, what's that all about? And I'm going to read you something real quick here from, it's the May, and you can go look it up if you want to yourself. I'm sure you can find anything on the internet. The May-June 1985 issue. Isn't that something? 35 years ago. And it's a journal called the Biblical Archaeology Review. And it says, in legal deeds from the 6th century BC, the 500s, the parties swear oaths by the gods and the king according to a well-known and long-standing practice. In some of those deeds, from the reign of Nabonidus, we find that the parties swear by Nabonidus and by Belshazzar, the king's son. This formula, swearing by the king and his son, is unattested in any other reign in any documents yet uncovered. So, as of 1985, as of 35 years ago, there is no other place, and it wasn't normal in Babylon for the king to leave his son in charge and go running around the country. That's not what usually happened. And because it wasn't usual, the people that are reading this going, well, Belshazzar is not even one of the kings. It wasn't even considered that could be a possibility because it wasn't normal. And it's not that it wasn't written down, it wasn't recorded. It was just something unusual. It's probably along the line somewhere of, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and George Bush. George, we have George Bush and George W. Bush. I mean, those are two. We say that, and see, in our recent collective memory, we know exactly what we're talking about. But boy, 1,000 years from now, somebody's looking up stuff or whatever, and boy, George Bush, these must be the same guy or the same president. No, they were son, and here's what happened, and here was the situation. It's not normal, but it did happen. And so there's a lot of things. I get off looking at history, and we get off track here. So, but let's get into chapter 5 in verse 8. Okay, so that's what the third ruler is. See, the Bible has these details. The Bible, we can't always explain them. Like I just explained, why is he offering the third ruler? Why didn't he just offer it why it'd be the second ruler? Because he couldn't. His dad was still alive, and he knew that. And it wasn't questioned here. People, they knew what that meant, but we don't. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. Just because we don't know something doesn't mean that it's not true. The Bible is revealing to us, and we shouldn't take the stance that we know better than what's going on here. This is God's word and trustworthy. So in verse 8 it says, now all the king's wise men came but they could not read the writing or make known the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. And the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall, and the queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the Spirit of the Holy God, as in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. See, they didn't turn away from their gods, and look, see, this is their last. He didn't even come to mind. They're talking about Daniel here. The queen. Hey, don't get too worried. We've got somebody. We've got a last resort. Oh, I forgot about this guy. See, in Daniel, there's a lot that we can learn here. It says, "And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief." Now, that doesn't mean that it was Nebuchadnezzar was his father. Could have been his great grandfather. But we talk about the founding fathers. It's the same thing. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians and the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. And that doesn't mean that he was one of them. Remember, those guys are the ones who tried to frame him to go into the lion's den. They didn't all just turn because Nebuchadnezzar said what he said in chapter 4. Doesn't mean they all turned and they all became Christians. That's not what happened. They all became, followers of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's not what happened. It says in verse 12 here, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas or mysteries were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. See, Daniel, we can learn something here. We can learn something from all 31,103 verses. But here is number one, these people are calling in Daniel God's representative. I mean, it's like us referring to the Bible. They're referring to God's word and God's prophet last. See, that's the last resort. He's one of many and the least important in our daily lives. He's not something that comes to mind regularly and frequently. And I want you to notice he wasn't invited to the party. See, Daniel's not sitting around going, "Oh, I can help you with that." It's not like, "Oh, somebody had a heart attack and is there a doctor in the house?" And he comes forward. They had to go get him. See, Daniel wasn't a part of the royal life anymore. He was an older man that, obviously had been around for a while, and they're remembering, oh, maybe that old man can help us, and maybe he knows some things. And the queen seems to have confidence in him for some reason, and she's heard the stories and she believes them. But Belshazzar, the king here, the king's son, Nabonidus' son, doesn't even come to mind. So not only is he a last thought, a final thought, almost an afterthought, he is not present at the party. And you know what else that means for us who are eager to... It's wonderful that, I'm just going to say this, it's wonderful in these times that, we should be active citizens in the United States. We're in the United States. If anybody's watching this out of country, we're in the United States. I'm here in Pennsylvania, about 2 hours due west of New York City and 2 hours straight north of Philadelphia, right in the heart of all of what goes on. And do you know, there's so much... There's a lot of angst nowadays, especially amid the coronavirus. That's where we're at. I'm in the middle of the quarantine and doing this. And do you know, people are they're talking more about the Constitution than the Bible. See, what God says about it is our last resort. And I love the Constitution. As a matter of fact, I'm a student of it. I love it. I love history and the United States. And it's interesting how the United States came about. But I'm going to say this in terms of world history, not a patriot that loves my country. The United States is normal. It's not special. It is, when we turn away from God, bad things happen. And that doesn't mean that the coronavirus is a judgment of the United States. It's going on globally. And I talked about I think in one of the chewables, I can't remember which number it was, but early on, is the coronavirus in the Bible. So you can go back and look at that in the first few. But do you know, fighting for our rights is not something, our rights. Christianity is about giving up your rights. Thinking about others is more important than yourself. And that doesn't mean, Paul was a citizen of Rome, remember? And he said, hey, I have the right to, should you be beating me? I have the right not to be beaten before due process. And a lot of what happened to Paul was because he was, saying, well, I have the right to be judged as a Roman citizen. I want to be doing that. And so that's okay. But when he was denied those rights, he wasn't in the face of the king demanding his rights. See, he reminded people, we have the right of. He corrected people with gentleness, not with harshness. Yeah, you can smile at people and correct them. It throws them off guard a little bit, but they, I love you and you're wrong about this, but to be a part of that kind of thing. I want you to know Daniel was a godly man that the Lord used over and over in the presence of kings. And see, the Lord let the kings bring them to mind. Daniel was not only not at the party, he was last on their minds. And that means, do you know what that means? That he wasn't in their face all the time talking about the God of that Nebuchadnezzar praised. Remember when, I mean, it was, by this time, the fiery furnace had been decades ago. And so he wasn't in the face of the leaders of the time. It's just something food for thought and prayer, and to let the Lord shape your heart about that. But okay, so see, there's a lot here, and that's why I wanted to go through it verse by verse, and even so it can be a meal. But we're eating this meal together, so maybe this part is not so much vitamin, But so it says here, but you can go a lot deeper on your own. So in verse 11, the queen calls him to mind, to Belshazzar, and it says, inasmuch, in verse 12, as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel, who is Belteshazzar, be called, and he will give the interpretation. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, the Babylonian captivity, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you. See, he hasn't even met Daniel before. Never even met him. I have heard of you. Are you him? That the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. And so we'll find out what happens next in the next part. Okay? Bye.